Hello, I'm Sydney, and I am a fan of horror movies.
I'm Andrew, and I love Hereditary.
I'm Ashley, and I hate horror movies.
So, on that note, we will be analyzing the movie Hereditary by Ari Aster.
Okay, so our first article was The Horror Film and the Horror of Film by David Lavery. And there are two quotes that stuck out to me when we were reading this. So the first one is, in a sense, the genre of horror film, if we define such to be all films whose primary effect is to surprise, terrify, or alienate an audience by means of a narrative and cinematic techniques which are disorienting and aggressive, violent, or discomfort. I felt all of that throughout this movie.
But I mean, I guess that's good for the director. Like, it's like on purpose to make you kind of want to feel that way. The directors are very good at what they want the audience to feel. That kind of goes into the horror films Tales to Master Terror, Shapers of Trauma by Bruce Ballin. He kind of talks about how the directors kind of target a certain audience, and they want people who are directly affected by certain things to feel a certain way about movies. So with Hereditary, I feel like Ari Aster kind of wanted people who had family issues or trust issues in the family to kind of realize make it hit harder for them. It was already a heavy-hitting movie, but
it was a very personal film.
Mm-hmm.
You almost felt as a member of the family.
Right, and I think that's how he hit that horror aspect so hard. It's not just like Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers are running through the town. It's a family unit that this is affecting.
Right, it's not just the gore that makes it horror, it's more these are things that families go through. They go through this grief that the family in Hereditary is going through, and they're all grappling with it together, and I think that's what makes it hit so hard and close to home for a lot of the viewers.
Mm-hmm. I think that really it hits very psychologically. So when you talk about the psychoanalytic analysis, in our textbook, so the constant curbing of drives according to social convention is really showed throughout the movie, in that Payman and the cult are repressed by society, and they wait years to find the perfect host. And then that drive, when it's frustrated or repressed, it can go into an easier channel, so it can kind of show through. And that's when we see it in Charlie in the Bond with the Grandma, because Payman was in Charlie first, but it wasn't the right host. But that's how they have such a close bond, because they're the king and the queen.
Yeah, and the entire history, that's why it's called Hereditary, is because it wasn't just this family had a freak occurrence. It was the grandma through the generations kind of built up to Payman. She tried it with her husband and her first son. They ended up dying because of all the experiments she kind of or rituals she tried to do on them, and they failed. And then so with her daughter, she tried to she literally forced her to have kids in order to successfully create Payman.
I think that's the scariest part of the movie.
That is really scary, just to learn how much the grandma was manipulating this whole family, and especially when
after death.
Yeah,
right.
The effect she had more effect on the family after she died than she did.
Right. Even
I feel during her life.
And the mom knew that, but she just not to the extent that it ended up happening.
Yeah.
So the next thing related to that is the sexual drive, eros. You see that, and not a physically sexual drive, even though this would be a good time to point out our favorite line from the movie. Bring your dick.
The best part, arguably.
I didn't know we were gonna go there, but that's all right.
Oh, well, I don't have a filter, so
clearly.
Fair enough.
But instead of seeing that actually happen, we see eros through the connection between Charlie and Grandma again, because it's the king and queen unit. And then obviously death drive, thanatos. You see that in destruction, which is the death of Charlie and the parents in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
So then we have the unconscious addressed in the film. So that's how the mind copes with frustration and lack of fulfillment of drives, and they're really suppressed, but they always submerge, wish for the object in into the unconscious. So that's when we see Charlie killing the birds,
Right.
kind of repressing that and suppressing it.
Well, and then you learn later that that's just a sign for payment.
It's very like it doesn't tell you right away, but it's like one of those movies where it's like you have to watch it all the way through to kind of like get it.
The symbols in the movie, which is like part of like orders of human experience, the symbolic. So we have the clicking, the cult emblem throughout the movie with the necklace, and birds, lots of birds with heads cut off.
Yeah.
And then the
Just beheading in general.
Yeah.
Lots of that.
I think my favorite appearance of the cult emblem was probably where it foreshadowed where Charlie was going to die.
Yeah.
That was definitely shocking to be like, oh, why is that there on the telephone pole? And then later, that's where she's literally beheaded. And it's like, oh, okay, cool.
I think another big symbol is the mom's line of work. She builds like model houses and like other things for companies, but she also does it on her like free time as like a hobby. And so you see throughout the movie like her, she makes like a doll kind of like her grandma and places it throughout the house. And so it's kind of like she's kind of like breaking the fourth wall a little bit with it being like, yeah, the grandma's like here and she's like kind of still with us.
Yeah, it really addresses how humans cope with things too. Like with the mom making I think there was one scene where she actually makes Charlie with her head cut off on the pole.
Yeah, Charlie's death.
Yeah. I think another really real scene relating to like horror being real and not just being monsters and stuff is when they do the seance and Peter's like, Mom, I'm scared, I'm really scared. And then Charlie is speaking through the mom that she's also really scared. It felt like you were transported back to your childhood. You know, like when you're like afraid of the dark and you're like, Mom, Dad, I'm scared. It was so real in that scene.
Right.
And that's another part how he just puts the audience right there with him.
It kind of shows too that Charlie also had no idea what was wrong with her.
Yeah.
Because she had been filled with this demonic spirit by her grandma. And she had no idea. She just like was an odd child, kind of did weird things, and you're like, okay, that's just a little weird. But you didn't realize that she was actually just possessed by a demon until...
For her whole life.
Yeah.
Something that I found interesting just about horror as a genre was how it tends to express like what culture is going through. From Nightmare in the Horror Genre by Carol. And yeah, so just some examples given in that article were depression, recession, strife, inflation, national confusion. So I guess grief would be a big part of Hereditary.
Yeah.
That's a lot of common themes in horror movies is they always try and leave, I think, like a like an underlying message. Like Get Out by Jordan Peele is also a great film like analysts have talked about where there's underlying messages inside the film that...
I think it's really cool though that grief is one they focus on in the movie because usually in horror movies no one has time to really grieve anything because you're just running from the monster, like we said earlier. But in this one, like it's just a train of people being killed and Peter experiencing this like horrible grief, and coping while he also has this demon trying to possess him.
Like they're really trying to get him weak enough to the point where Payman can possess him, right?
Yeah, like mentally break him down enough. That's why they have the whole like scenes where it's like that weird visual thing where it kind of like zones into places. And another thing that's interesting, I think, about this kind of movie is that it doesn't end on a happy note. Because, you know, in most like horror films, like you were talking about, like with Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street, any of those kind of like classic slasher, it's always like the girl defeats evil, like she defeats the killer, and then but it's like always like, you know, there's always the end where it's like, oh, they came back, and that's why.
Yeah.
But like in this, it literally was just like, yeah, he's possessed, and that's it.
There's happy ending is he's the king.
Yeah,
it's a happy ending if you're the demon.
Yeah, it's happy for Payman. He has a human form, a male form too, which is what he was looking for.
Yeah.
And then the whole Naked Brothers band plays at the end.
That would be a good addition. So
that's my alternate ending. The entire Naked Brothers band singing Banana Smoothie.
So, and also Payman wants this ideal young male host because like why wouldn't he? Because
why wouldn't
phallocentrism. So more on that.
The social condition where like images or representations of the male phallus carry connotations of power and dominance is phallocentrism. And yeah, like you said, this relates to Payman wanting the male host. It's 2019. Why couldn't you just settle?
I mean,
That's true.
misogyny is also a huge part in just all horror films in general, I feel like.
Well, also the history of King Payman, it kind of goes into that. I really feel like I'm like channeling him by talking about him so much.
It's okay, the crucifix is up there.
Oh, it
So
is. But it goes into the history of that, and it's during what, like 1500s or even earlier than that.
Yeah. It's
So
like
women definitely didn't have a role in that society, which would make sense why it's fairly
And
phallocentric.
every female that he was in, Charlie, the mom, the grandma eventually, all of them were decapitated. They were beheaded, and like he like controlled their bodies.
So something interesting to me was how the dad really seemed like the only sane one in the whole movie, and you really feel so bad for him, especially just with how he dies and catches on fire. Poor guy. And you know, he's not possessed, but he is like, he could be this awesome male host, but then it ends up being because he's not a part of this bloodline, which is why the movie's called Hereditary. Well, and his death was definitely interesting too, just because
He's
before
spontaneously combusted.
yeah, but she thought that she was gonna catch on fire by throwing that the book,
Charlie's
the notebook,
book.
yeah, into the fire, but when she did it the second time, he caught on fire instead of her. So that just kind of shows that the devil's rules do not
Yeah.
adhere to like
I feel
human
like
rules,
it's
which makes it really
very-
scary.
It's
Yeah.
very hellish.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not just like, oh, since they threw it into the fire, that's why he's catching on fire.
Right.
It's because like it's all relating to hell. Which
Mm-hmm.
doesn't he come from like the seventh ring of hell or something?
He's
What's
like
that
one of the
class?
kings of hell.
Something we've talked about a lot in class is hegemony.
Mm-hmm.
And a really good example of that is at the end when Peter like gives into the cult.
Mm-hmm.
He like really like subverts to the dominant culture around him.
Yeah, supporting something that does not support him, you know? Another interesting concept for us to touch on is how the grandma was not headless when she was buried.
Mm-hmm. Well, we
If
know.
anyone
Well,
has her head, we want it back.
but that's when we kind of see, like, with this, kind of ties in with her sleepwalking, which we'll talk about, but with her sleepwalking, like, you kind of see that not everything is right with the mother. Like,
Yeah.
right away, you already see, like, how she handles her mother's death. She's not grieving at all.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, she explicitly, like, tells her husband, she's like, I should be sadder, but
she
I'm
just
not.
expresses anger almost with
Yeah.
how like her mother raised her and the rest of her family and everything.
Well,
Yeah.
a lot of people, like, when you grow up like that in a household where there's no love, there's just lots of hurt and manipulation. Yeah, that's all she knows how to give.
Mm-hmm.
And she has that breakdown when she tries to kill Peter, and like she realizes, and he's like, you don't love me, but I think it's because she doesn't know true love.
Yeah, and she pities her mom, like when she goes to that one, like, seminar about like the grieving a lost one, and it's like she talks about how her mom had a rough life because her dad died and her brother killed herself, but she doesn't realize that like she was the one pulling the strings of
Right.
that whole thing.
Bouncing back to like a cultural analysis of the movie, so like we talk about ideological dominance, and so the first point is that myth preserves ideology by the active retelling and reproduction of culturally dominant stories, and I think this is how the cult in the movie like really makes its way to be a little bit mainstream, as
Right.
in like they have the cult in their town.
Mhm.
And then that ideology is preserved through like silencing and controlling the norms around what can and cannot be challenged.
Mm-hmm.
So we can see that in the manipulation of like the family to create the host and going through all the bodies and stuff. And then hegemony preserves the ideology through one consent and the absorption of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's at the end, we see that when he just gives in and submits himself to the cult. So I think that's a really important point to bring up.
Another interesting thing about horror movies and how they kind of work is I kind of talked about it earlier about how they usually end on a happier note, but with the movies that do like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and Hereditary, they all end on like it's just like, okay, evil won, and like that's it.
That's depressing.
So yeah, it's like, I don't know, it's kind of interesting of like how that affects audiences, because audiences or people watching the movie are usually like expecting the turnaround. They're expecting the like Peter to come back and be like, no, like I know how to beat this, like I'll just go through grandma's stuff and like reverse it or something. Mm-hmm. But that never happens. Payman wins, and then it's just like, well, now what? And that kind of like correlates with society, because now it's like we're in a kind of state of mind in society where it's like, okay, now what are we doing with like technology and how all of that's working? It's like, okay, where's the hope?
It calls out like the imbalances of power in society when he succumbs to that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's sad because it builds the mom up. She finds all of this stuff out, and it seems like she's gonna get so close to beating Payman and beating what her mom was building up with like the book, and how she's like, no, I just need to destroy it and I need to do this. And it seems like she's so close, but then there's that moment where she's like terrified of the fire that honestly was my favorite part of the movie. Mm-hmm. Like that was chilling, when her face just goes like from screaming to completely blank, and that's like the moment that she is then possessed. And I feel like that's when all of the hope is gone, because Peter has no idea what's happening.
Like it kind of calls out like the selfish, like makes selfish people more aware, because like the mom very much did focus on herself. Like she played it off as she was caring for the family. Like when we see that kind of happening when she's arguing with Peter at the dinner table, like her argument was not there. Peter was like, I'm just chilling. Yeah. And so it kind of like makes like the people who think they are being selfless realize, like, is it actually just you being selfish?
So what does this mean? Like, what does Hereditary mean for society? What's the whole point of the movie? I think it's in the name, and we can talk about that. So Hereditary, as in like it goes through the bloodline of the family and everything, but also in that like the real monsters are within us, and it's hereditary. Like the grandma's demons were passed down to the mom and then to her kids and stuff, and that's how a lot of things happen in society too. Like things are passed on through generations, like ignorance and hate and these practices as a society, and what does it take to break those? Yeah.
And it kind of focuses on, like you were saying, like the past does shape who we are. Like we always hear, don't dwell on the past, but it shapes who we are.
Yeah.
And shapes how society is going to be. Because every decision that's been made in the past has led up to this point and beyond.
Overall, Aster did a really good job scaring the shit out of people with people.
And it was both psychoanalytical and cultural.
If you haven't seen the movie, check it out. That's all I gotta say.
It was really good. I enjoyed it a lot.
I love the movie.
Yeah.